welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and sometimes we get into issues and subject matter and we feel like we may be out on an island. Then we find that we aren't as alone as we thought. And joining us now from the Daily Signal, the daily newspaper put out by the Heritage Foundation, as well as the host of the Right Side of History podcast. He is Jarrett Stepman. Jarrett, thanks for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Not at all, not at all. And I was going through some of your stuff, and I loved your piece, the consequences of historical ignorance. I thought I was the only one that found something ironic in David Hogg's stance as they marched out on 420 to show solidarity in the history of Columbine, not quite understanding what else happened on April 20th. And I guess that's where we come to this, the Columbine anniversary, the walkout, David Hogg using teenagers to win over adults. It seems like there's a lot of historic things that have been forgotten in the 60 or so years since those wars were fought. Is that where you came down on this as well, and talking about some of the things that have made our high schools less safe in the last 10 years in a shorter period?
Well, absolutely. I think there is unfortunately, I think there is a dearth of proper teaching about history, especially American history, that's left a lot of young people ignorant of what their country is about, what the foundations of what this country are. And I think that kind of historical ignorance feeds into a lot of misinformation sounding like wisdom, like you've heard from Hogg and others, telling people things that simply aren't true or aren't based in the reality of what history is. And it's been very interesting to me to see lately, especially given that we're coming off of a historical birthday of Karl Marx in particular. I've seen so much historical revisionism to this figure and basically whitewashing all the things that his ideology actually meant. I think this is a very disturbing thing. It's a very bad thing for future generations of Americans if they don't have a clear understanding to at least begin to have a debate about the issues that are most important to us. If there's a certain element of history that's completely missing from their mental vocabulary, I think that's a deeply troubling development in American society.
Well, you look at what happened in the horrific tragedies that befell some families in North Korea while we celebrate the release of some prisoners, some connected to us here in Virginia through their college days, did not come back so lucky. And you talk about the history of Karl Marx. Though he wasn't a dictator, the governments that were formed off of his writing have all devolved into dictatorships. We watch what's happening in Venezuela. So even without history, we should be able to teach this. Why do you think we have this almost allergy to pointing these things out?
Well, I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of bad actors in schools and institutions of education. I think that is one of the very big problems right now. I think there are a lot of rightly frustrated parents who think that a lot of their textbooks are not teaching the right things to young students. I think there's definitely a willingness on some people's part to misguide the general public. I thought it was very interesting lately that there was this article that was published in Teen Vogue, of all places, basically celebrating Karl Marx and trying to introduce him to the youngest generation, not explaining that the consequences of his ideology were, in many cases, mass death in countries around the globe. This writer said that there were social movements in places like China and Venezuela, but didn't explain how these so-called social movements led to mass casualties and violence. And so if you take Marx's ideas as just an ideological experiment without the view of history, without the consequences, you're doing a real disservice to yourself. In some ways, Marx at least had the excuse that he could legitimately say his ideas hadn't been tried yet. Yeah. We don't have that excuse. Yeah. We're 150 years later. We've seen the consequences of these ideas. To ignore those things and to pretend like they didn't happen in the last 150 years, I think we're making terrible mistakes. We're repeating the mistakes of the past in our history.
Do you find, as I do, when you read Marx, that one of the things he didn't take into account is human nature, and that our human interest, and self-interest is not a bad thing, and it's something that actually works for a society, not against it?
Absolutely. I think that is one of the critical foundational problems with Karl Marx. He basically didn't think that human nature existed, that we could kind of go beyond this. He kind of had this materialistic view of the world, and I think that is, I think what's good to teach about, for instance, the founding fathers, who I think of the United States, who very much did understand human nature. They knew that it could produce both good and bad things, and they produced a government that had a series of checks and balances. They know that human nature tends to corruption, and they try to create a system that worked with human nature to try to create something that's better for all of us. Marxism is based on class conflict. It's about conflict between people. It's I think one of the most devastating aspects of communism is that it doesn't lead to some kind of utopia. It leads to violence. It leads to warfare. It leads to bloodshed. It leads to terrible things. There's no grand utopia at the end of Marxism, and frankly, we should know that by now. We've seen enough evidence to say this is what Marxism really is in practice, and it's a terrible thing.
Well, and when you talk about the practice of it, and you look at the friction and self-interest, I mean, some of the greatest friction in American history was between two of the authors of the foundation of it all, the Declaration of Independence here in our flagship city of Charlottesville, certainly Jefferson, but Adams, and the friction between the two of them, or the friction between James Madison and Patrick Henry, was another great moment where, that friction created the Bill of Rights. To think that everyone will march in the same direction. Some of the most amazing works of human governance, never mind anything else that comes along, were created out of really rancorous, awkward, and frustrating, and in some ways very angry friction between people.
Absolutely, and I think that in many ways that helped produce in this country getting closer to the truth. I mean, that is what our system was designed for. That's why we have freedom. I mean, it's to find the truth. It isn't. I mean, people talk about issues such as fake news, or they talk about all these other issues that are associated with having a certain level of freedom in society. But I think those things actually lead to better consequences in the end when you can have truth. Marxist systems or communist systems don't tolerate dissent. They just assume that everybody's going to believe the same thing. And if you're an outsider, if you're a dissenter, if you disagree with that sentiment, you're going to be shut down. You're going to be thrown in prison. There's, of course, there's this great book by Solzhenitsyn called Gulag Archipelago, where there were political dissidents in the Soviet Union were thrown in mass in prison for having the wrong political ideas. That's what's truly dangerous, to think that everybody should agree and everybody should kind of go the same way. That leads to incredible tyrannies. America was based on a system that allowed for freedom and allowed for dissent, and allowed for these kind of debates that we would hope would make us a better people in the long run. Not the kind of forced conformity of the Marxist systems that actually ends up where everybody's equally miserable, except for some people at the very, very top who control that system, which is kind of one of the very grand lies of what Marxism really is.
And one of its great undoings, when people start to realize, well, hold it, I thought we were all equal. Why do these guys get nice houses and nice cars? And that starts to become as long as people don't get all thrown into prison. Jarrett Stepman is the author of podcasts for the Daily Signal called The Right Side of History, and we're into sort of the historical irony of April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Columbine, and then David Hogg and the March for Attention. I mean, March for it really was a March for Attention, and their attempts to use our teenagers and our adolescents against the adult population, in all irony. But more than that, what happened at Stoneman Douglas High School, has a much more recent history too, doesn't it, Jarrett? It goes into this idea that you can sugarcoat problems, and by sugarcoating them, they'll go away. And instead of dealing with problems with arrests and kids in trouble, we can just not put them in trouble, and therefore the statistics bear out that we're doing better. That's one of those parts of the Stoneman Douglas story that isn't being told, at least not enough.
Not at all. And I think this is something that, the media itself has focused like a laser on the gun control debate when they really should be talking about the kind of catastrophic policies that allowed somebody like the school shooter who was there slip through the cracks. And this is a serious problem that was created by bad federal policies. It was an attempt by the Obama administration that Parkland and the Broward County was very much a part of that tried to end the so-called school-to-prison pipeline. And the fact is they basically stopped punishing students. And a lot of the troublemakers, a lot of the people who were bullies and bad apples knew that. They knew that this was going to happen. And unfortunately, the district has hidden a lot of material from the public that is now starting to come to light, that the shooter was actually in some of these controversial programs that attempted to not punish these students, that focus on kind of rehabilitation that wasn't working. And this has left a lot of students in these places in harm's way. And these are policies that are now being enacted across the country based on a false premise. And this is a very dangerous thing for American kids, and certainly a lot of parents should be worried about this. But you won't hear much of this from the media. The media is so focused like a laser on this gun control issue, and they want to gin up popularity for this issue, that they're ignoring the real problems that occurred in places like Broward County that, frankly, are leading to potential violence down the road and terrible things. And this is an awful thing.
Well, and it sort of goes back to your construct of, don't ask, don't tell, don't talk about it, don't dissent. If you hide problems, if you deny that problems exist, they just get worse. If you deny, hate speech, then the hate speech gets worse. If you tell people that political correctness is the way to go, you're just going to foment worse things in the dark crevices of humanity rather than having free speech where everyone speaks, and then, if you want to use the phrase, the marketplace will teach people that's not acceptable because everyone wants to be listened to. And if you're saying ridiculous, hateful things, people are going to stop listening to you, and your ideas will wither and die on the vine if nobody's there to listen to you. But if you drive it all underground, then it has this gravitas of maybe it's crazy, but it's underground, so it's got to be cool. It's like telling a kid, don't touch those cookies, and the first thing they're going to do is touch the cookies.
Well, that's absolutely right, and I have to give credit to some of the people there in Parkland, especially this young student, Kenneth Preston, who's actually done a little journalism for himself that the major networks haven't done, and actually uncovered some of the corruption in his school and found a lot of the funds that were appropriated there for school safety had not been spent, and the school had relied on this very bad program that is leading to the harm of students in the district, not just with the school shooter, but others as well. And I think that really is showing how the truth eventually starts to get out. I think there are a lot of parents that start getting frustrated. They're seeing what's going on in their schools, and I don't think they're happy about it. And this is what the system of a free press and things like this really do for a country, is that we get closer to the truth. We get closer to finding what actually is, rather than just something based on an ideology or what people want to believe, which I think in large part is what Marxism and socialism and things like this really are. I mean, they're ideologies, and if you don't believe, well, then we're just going to have to shut you down until you realize the fact that our creed is the best and no other ones can dissent. And I think that's a terrible thing. I think that leads to incredible destruction. I think that history has in large part proved that to be correct, and that the American system, the real American way, is designed by our founders and carried out by generations of Americans, is ultimately superior to all other ones and leads to good outcomes for people in this country.
Jarrett, you have such enthusiasm, and one of the things that always breaks my heart is that if you look back over history, and since history is your pigeon, it's notable to say that the United States, the experiment that Jefferson and Madison and Patrick Henry and John Adams all fought for, and we shall pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to, is but a blip on the human history radar at this point. And part of why I think all this statism becomes such a challenge for us, because we are a relatively new idea. 240 years is hardly societally impactful. Most of human history has been under despotism, and it's hard to push people to that point where they understand that despotism is very hard to get rid of once you allow it into the door, and you need that historical context, but you need to go see what despotism looks like. And that's where I think the media is failing us. We're not showing people what despotism looks like. We take these, quote, tours to Cuba, and we show everyone, oh, isn't it great? Look, they have all these historic cars. Well, no, they have those historic cars because they can't get new ones. And those things, and they make Cuba look like this great vacation destination, or they talk about all the marvelous things in North Korea that we're missing out on, or the National Health Service has done such amazing things, except if you're a little baby with some health issues. These are the things that our media just is letting us down with.
Absolutely, and the grand scheme of history and the 200 or so years that America has been in existence, it's created more prosperity for the average person than any civilization in history. I mean, this is an incredible story. It's created the kind of prosperity that you've never seen in systems like for instance the Soviet Union, which at the end was more focused on building tanks than feeding its own people in a time of peace. I mean, the United States has created this incredible prosperity, and seeing the end stages of these kind of horrible leftist ideas like we're seeing now in Venezuela, a system that was touted just a few years ago by organizations like the New York Times as this grand miracle, where people now struggle to find even toilet paper in the stores, should show you the difference in what these two systems have been. And I think that's something that's lost on a lot of people, and I think unfortunately there's a lot of ignorance and there's a lot of willful malpractice by educators of young people in this country who don't see this stark difference. And I think we have every right to defend the system of free markets that we've enjoyed in this country, that have created this kind of prosperity, and look with deep suspicion toward these kind of organizations of people like communism and socialism that have led to mass misery in a very short amount of time. I mean, there's a stark difference between these systems that should be very apparent.
And I'm glad you're doing that, and I think we as media need to do it. But it seems like the millennials, there are so many of them that are doing, as you mentioned, the young man in Broward County that's unearthed so much of the stuff that is what had been marginalized as conservative talk radio and conservative media had been pointing out, finding these things, and then the kids, seeing and seeing the protests in England over the media coverage of the royal baby on the same weekend that Alfie Evans dies. These things, I carry some hope that the young people are seeing this, because I've found with 3 millennial children of my own, nobody sees through BS faster than a young person. Are you sensing the same thing?
Well, I do think that eventually, I know there are a lot of polls that show that young millennials certainly have a lot of left-wing views, and I think some of this comes from their schools and their teachers, but I think they haven't seen some of the kind of terrible things that have come down from especially, socialist ideas. They didn't live in the shadow of the Cold War like the previous generation did, and I think over time, I think the American people, I think every generation has had a certain amount of common sense, and ultimately I think the truth will eventually triumph. I mean, I do very strongly believe in that. And even if young people hold some wild views that aren't correct, I think seeing the truth and bringing that to light will change a lot of minds. And I do think that there is certainly the potential for a turnaround when we do see some of the kind of nonsense produced by some of these systems that just don't work. And I think ultimately, in the young American people, they want to have a prosperous future where they can take care of themselves and they can be independent adults and join the rest of the generations of Americans who have found prosperity and made things better for the next generation. I think the same holds true with millennials. And despite the fact that I think some of their views are maybe a little bit crazy right now, I think that there will be changes in the future when they see the product of bad ideas in the long run.
But it's on us to make sure they see it. And thank you for what you do, Jarrett Stepman, Daily Signal podcast host and author for them there. Again, you can find them at dailysignal.com, right side of history. Some great stuff there, Jarrett. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And thank you for listening this week. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, you can find us online at tertiumquids.org. My name is Joe Thomas here in the second greatest city in the history of mankind, as Jared and I were just talking about. More people in freedom on the planet than any other town in America, save Jerusalem, thanks to Jesus. So long, and thanks for all the fish. Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, online at tertiumquids.org. Also, follow the links and find us on Facebook and Twitter, and follow us there as well. While we can, anyway. Net neutrality is back. It's the zombie regulations that keep coming back. And where in the world is what is that guy on The Walking Dead? He's got the baseball bat with the barbed wire. Hey, we're going to get some detail and some reality check on net neutrality this week. And we begin with none less than the former FCC Wireless Bureau Chief and the Director of Tech Knowledge at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Fred Campbell is on with us. Good morning, Fred. Thank you for taking some time out with us and sharing your insight. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, no, not at all. From somebody who began his broadcasting career back in the days of the Fairness Doctrine, I always worry about these sorts of things because I knew that even back then, the Fairness Doctrine actually was a way to suppress speech, not to encourage it. So I worry when we see these things. First and foremost, I don't know if you want to get into over-under or what odds making could be, but it passed out of the Senate with a narrow margin. What about the House as it comes back to the U.S. House of Representatives? What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, the general consensus is that this effort to restore the Obama-era approach to net neutrality, those rules will fail in the House, or even if it succeeds there, that President Trump will veto it. That's the general consensus. I do think it's possible. The groups largely on the left who heavily support this are throwing a lot of weight and energy behind it. So it's a risk that I take seriously.
Oh, I don't disagree, and I think the campaign behind it has been very effective regarding convincing people that these regulations are protecting or somehow like Robin Hood going to give you better access to the internet, while meanwhile all the time the folks who are promoting them are the biggest wireless carriers and bandwidth users in the first place.
Yeah, they've used a very effective slogan. Their slogan is, without these rules, we'll see the end of the internet as we know it. That's not true. There's really no evidence to back that up. But, at a high level, that sounds scary. And it's been enough to get a lot of people interested in the issue. And, unfortunately, it's difficult to combat because the explanations as to why it isn't true are more complicated and harder to do with just a slogan.
The phrase, though, and I play with words all the time, but when somebody says it'll be the end of something as we know it, it often means as we know it, or as we have figured it out, or as we manipulate it. It really is about their protecting their share or their position in that marketplace, and oftentimes to the detriment of free choices and perhaps a competitive marketplace for even something as arcane as a social media platform.
That's incredibly insightful, because you could rephrase the slogan as, it will end the Internet as Silicon Valley companies want it to be.
Yes.
Wouldn't be those as companies are the big beneficiaries of the Obama-era net neutrality rules. I mean, nobody disagrees that if any one company becomes too powerful, has too much control over the Internet, that there could be problems. I mean, that's true in any area, and it's typical antitrust law.
Mm-hmm.
The question is there too much power somewhere on the Internet, and what to do about it? And the Obama approach said, the Internet service providers, they're not competitive enough, factually not true, and so they have too much power. We need to have rules that prevent them from modifying their business plans or evolving with time and technology. But the biggest powers today on the Internet are companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook, and that could very well be a result of the Obama-era net neutrality rules protecting their business plans while squelching the potential business plans of their competitors.
Well, speak about that on and of itself, because I think the Internet is still at this point one of those great opportunities where perhaps on a grander scale than any other time in human history, never mind American history, somebody can come up with an idea, put it together, get it sourced up, whether it be a book, a film, or nailing, as George Carlin once said, nailing two pieces of wood that have never been nailed together before, and putting it up for marketplace to the widest possible audience and customer opportunities that have ever been seen before. You used to have to go rent a shop on Main Street. You had to go and do all these things, and plead the agencies to get permission to sell it on the street corner or whatever it may be. And now all you need to do is get with GoDaddy.com, get that domain registered, and you can start selling something. And it's amazing that we're trying to dampen that.
Yeah, and that's still largely true. And that's been one of the biggest problems with the details of the net neutrality advocates' argument that net neutrality is necessary to preserve Internet openness. The fact is that the Internet has been and still largely is very open without these net neutrality rules. So it begs the question as to why are they needed? And the biggest backers of these rules, financially, and the company that came up with the concept, Google, they're the beneficiaries, really, not consumers. The rules aren't really needed to protect consumers. Silicon Valley companies want the rules to protect their business models.
Well, I know that the history of the Federal Communications Commission goes back to where, you were trying to look at spectrum and making sure that somebody couldn't just sign on a transmitter in the town of their competitor to squelch their competitor's ability to be heard by radios and things like that, to make sure that the radio dials were fairly and the TV spectrum was worked out. Talk about the way the FCC has branched into this form of communication, and not just the electric broadcast transmissions, and have they been proactive or reactive to it, Fred?
Well, I think they've been a little bit of both. The debate at the FCC over this whole net neutrality issue started while I was there. Mm-hmm. And Google made what I consider the seminal filing on the topic back in 2007, where it argued we need these rules that just apply to one part of the industry. And it said we need these rules because everyone else acts openly on the Internet. All of us Silicon Valley companies, we're the good guys, and these ISPs are the bad guys. And, while I was there, the chairman that I worked for, took sort of a a moderate approach and said, okay, we'll adopt some principles around this that I think, as far as principles go, are good principles, and we'll look at it on a case-by-case basis, the same way that DOJ and FTC look at antitrust matters and other consumer protection issues. But so that was a sort of a proactive approach, but reactive to what Silicon Valley really wanted, which was a strict set of rules. Entered the Obama administration, and things became very proactive on the side of Silicon Valley and put a bunch of restrictive rules in place without a real showing that they're needed. And the result distorts the marketplace for the Internet and gives Silicon Valley a government advantage in competition in the space.
Fred, our founder here at the Virginia Institute was always fond of pointing to the deregulation of the telecommunications industry, that up until that point, the only innovation had come from going from a rotary phone to a touch dial phone. And then once the deregulation came in, now all of a sudden I have a computer in my pocket that, oh, by the way, I can call somebody on as well. And it's amazing to me that we seem to almost be retroactively looking at the Internet as something we should control the way we controlled the old phone companies.
Yeah, well, that's another area where net neutrality advocates have been surprisingly effective. I'm not sure I quite understand it, but one of their arguments is, hey, regulation worked great for the telephone system, so we need it for the Internet too. Now, my memory of telephone regulation accords with yours, which is that it was an era of particularly high prices.
Low choices.
Very expensive to make a long-distance call, and a lack of innovation.
Mm-hmm. It was fascinating, and and as a model, you talk about the infrastructure, and certainly nowadays you'll hear cell phone companies saying, "Well, what's this fee to?" And it's really a surcharge to those who had built the infrastructure on which the phone companies were operating. So if you were coming along and you were a long distance carrier that didn't build the phone lines, you were, I don't know if you want to call it a rental, but at least a usage fee to those who had spent the time and treasure to put up the phone lines and to do those things, or to launch a satellite into space. So, I mean, there's no inequity in that. It's understanding who did build it and that kind of thing. Fred Campbell is the former FCC Wireless Bureau Chief and is the Director of Tech Knowledge and contributor at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI.org. Fred, I want to ask you about the other side of net neutrality. During the Arab Spring, President Obama actually tweeted, in all irony, how impressed he was at the Egyptian government's ability to shut down Twitter and all the other social media sites by just basically shutting off the Internet in the country, because the Mubarak administration felt like that was how these revolutionaries were communicating. Is that a dangerous subset? I don't want to put the aluminum foil hat on. I'm not trying to say that, but is there a certain, while you've got the Googles and the Facebook saying, oh, please regulate us more, we'll help even, there's also the side of the government, the unindicted co-conspirator saying, yeah, we would like to have a little bit more authority and perhaps even somewhere have that mystical Internet kill switch if we need it.
Well, the same danger exists in the United States. It's just done in a much more sophisticated way. It's much more subtle. And so one thing is that in the U.S. there's a statute that exempts companies like Google and Facebook from liability for anything that they allow to be published on their sites, but also they have the ability to censor anything they'd like. And, those on the left have been pretty adamant that this censorship by companies like Google and Facebook and the like is necessary to squelch fake news. But there's a real danger there. And the danger is, well, who decides whether news is fake or not?
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out those companies get to decide whether news is fake or not. But the traditional common law that would police that, for publishers, traditional publishers like print newspapers, Congress has exempted those companies
mm-hmm.
from those laws. So it's awfully empowering for them, and it has a political power dimension as well.
Mm-hmm.
If Democrats give them what they want on net neutrality, don't they have an incentive to be a little more forgiving of Democratic viewpoints on their sides and a little more censorious of viewpoints from the other side?
And doesn't it also provide that foot in the door where the government could say, hey, we passed this law that helped your business out, now we need you to do this for us, almost in a quid pro quo sort of way?
Exactly right, and that would be the kind of thing. This is why it's more subtle. That wouldn't it wouldn't be expressed in a legislative debate, and it wouldn't be a transparent statutory provision. It would be the kinds of discussions that go on in meetings behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. And so this is called proxy by censorship, or censorship by proxy. I'm sorry.
Okay.
If the government itself can't censor a viewpoint because of the First Amendment. What it can do is convince the media, and in this case, the online media, to censor things for it.
Right,
and that's very dangerous.
And that's the other side of this that I've always found is my first jumping off point with net neutrality is not so much that these are businesses looking to protect themselves, but they're using this. And it's almost a chicken and egg thing. Which came first, the Google and the Amazon's interest in regulating the Internet or the government's interest in having a foothold on the Internet to help them regulate it? And that's the part that I find most troubling is that there was a story, Fred, if you remember, there was several years ago, Mark Zuckerberg was Time Magazine's Person of the Year, and I think you were probably still on the FCC at the time. And it was just a small, and the reporter completely let the part of the story go by. But the head of the FBI poked their head into Mark Zuckerberg's office. They were doing a spitball meeting early in the morning, having their Starbucks coffee, and the FBI director poked his head in his door and said, "Hey, Mark, we'll just be down in our corner office." And Mark waved to him, and the reporter never followed up on that. It was like, hold it, the FBI has an office at Facebook? What? But those are the kind of things that it's great to have a friend in that kind of place. If we're all willingly communicating in this site, it becomes really easy for the government to say, well, that's a great place to look in on what's going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this brings up sort of a debate related to net neutrality, and that's the privacy debate. Mm-hmm. One of the things the net neutrality rules under Obama did was applied stricter privacy regulation to ISPs, but they didn't do it with respect to Google and Facebook and Amazon, the companies that are collecting more data on us than any other companies in the world. And one might ask the question, well, why should those companies who are collecting more data than anyone else, be exempted from any sort of privacy regulation? And, a scary thought is, well, the data that they collect becomes a honeypot for the government mm-hmm. to access as well. And the companies will push back, make a public show of pushing back on handing their information over to the government. But at the end of the day, once all that information is collected, they have to give it to the government when they have a subpoena. And plus, there's really no way for the public to monitor what's happening with that data, either way.
Let me ask you this, Fred. You open up sort of a can of worms when you mention that, where privacy ends and public stature begins on the internet. We've seen this with AT&T and some of the FISA and the surveillance and the metadata collections. But one of the things that's bothered me, and you've mentioned both of them now, and you've triggered me on this, first and foremost is the ability to communicate fairly to somebody that they're ceding their privacy by clicking I accept on a fairly long, fairly legally mangled user agreement for an app or for an email service or those sorts of things. And is there a communication side to this where businesses need to be more transparent, if that's the right word, in their user agreements, so that a Cambridge Analytica can't go to Facebook and say, here, what's the price for all that user data, and that there's a price fee, and whether it's Cambridge Analytica or the Obama campaign in itself, that you're more aware of the things you're using and what you're signing off in regards to your private information.
Well, that would be, I think greater disclosure would be very helpful. One of the problems with that, though, and one of the problems with sort of ordinary free market analysis here, mm-hmm. is that, a lot of information is collected on you on the Internet without any sort of explicit agreement or transaction at all. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's almost impossible to use the Internet without being tracked for that reason. I won't get into all the technical ways that it happens, but every time you visit a website,
sure,
it's not just Google that can track you. All kinds of companies can track you. 14 or 15 companies at a time will track you, and you haven't clicked on any agreement with them. There's no signature involved, and I don't think most people realize that. So on the one hand, from a free market perspective, there are those who say, look, you agreed to let a company like Google, let's say, collect information about you when you decided to use their free services. But even assuming that analysis is a good one, there's still the question of, well, what about when they track me when I haven't agreed to it? Mm-hmm. And as you point out, does anyone really know the full extent of the tracking and how valuable it is?
I've heard it compared by law enforcement folks to can a law enforcement officer or anyone watch you walk down Main Street and stop into 2 or 3 different shops and write a list down of the things that you've stopped into? Oh, he went into the deli, he went into the bakery, he went into the bookstore. And they've compared browsing online to walking down Main Street. From an FCC tech expert's position, is that an apt comparison?
It is an apt comparison, with the difference that at least with the police officer following you around, if you're aware or paying a lot of attention, you could probably figure out that they're doing it. But there's with the online, you don't know which companies are doing it, and there's software you can download to figure out which companies are tracking you, but most people don't do that.
I understand that. You also mentioned something about publishers, and I asked this at the Consumer Electronics Show this past January, and sort of felt like the guy who passed gas in church for asking it. But I said, should some of these sites, since so much of the Consumer Electronics Show was about using the influencers and turning and using that marketing and finding the advertisers to go with the influencers, and I said, magazines do this, newspapers do this, and they've done it for years. Radio stations have done it for years, but we are doing it in terms of above board. We're saying, we're not taking your data and turning it into these things, but we also have that responsibility of, if I publish something in my magazine and it turns out to be blatantly false, and I didn't check to make sure that it was blatantly false, I can be sued and I'm held financially liable for it. You mentioned that Congress has exempted these companies, these online publishers, from it. Is there there a thought that can be changed? And I'm not one to say the government needs to regulate more, but at least leave these online publishers who are benefiting in the same way that a Time magazine or a New Yorker benefits from a contributor writing a column for them. But if it's a lie, then they can be held liable for it.
Yeah, I actually think the law that exempts them from liability should be repealed. And some would say, well, that's regulatory. I argue the exact opposite.
Sure.
The laws around publisher liability grew out of the common law. They've been around for centuries.
Mm-hmm. You can't just go and lie about
common law regulatory. So I advocate return it back to the common law. Now, whether that'll happen, obviously big tech is very, fights very, very hard to keep its privileges. But Congress did amend it at least with regard to sex trafficking recently, so that there's a little hope.
I appreciate your insight. And people can read your stuff and keep up with what you write for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI.org. Fred, it's been a joy having you on the program, and I have your phone number now, which means I'm going to call you more frequently.
Okay, no problem. Happy to talk anytime.
Oh, not at all. Fred Campbell, former FCC Wireless Bureau Chief on net neutrality and more. And, of course, as a reminder, you can find podcasts of all of these episodes through our website, tertiumquids.org.